I was brushing my teeth the morning my uncle changed the locks on the study door. That's not a metaphor. That's not me getting poetic. That's me holding a toothbrush in one hand and a mouthful of mini foam while the click-click of a new bolt echoed through the hallway of the house I now legally owned. And yet, in that exact moment, I didn't feel like I owned anything. Not the house. Not the air. Not even the sounds moving through it. 8 months ago, my mother died. Ovarian cancer, stage 4, aggressive and cruel in ways I still have nightmares about. She held my hand in those last weeks, a soft touch from a woman who spent her entire life believing in quiet strength and unspoken love. But before she passed, she did something no one in the family knew about. She transferred the title of the house, our old stone brick, colonial skeleton of a house in northern Connecticut, into my name. I was her only child. No ceremony. No discussion. Just paperwork slid across her lawyer's desk while I was out picking up her medication. I didn't even know until after the funeral. The funeral. That's when Uncle Martin appeared like a rain cloud dressed in borrowed grief. He gave a stiff eulogy, said she'd been the backbone of the family. I didn't correct him when he said she was survived by her loving brother. I didn't mention that I hadn't seen him in over a decade. That she hadn't spoken to him in the last 6 years. Family is complicated, I told myself. Death scrambles memories into something more palatable. When he asked to stay for a while, to help me adjust, I said yes. Because I was tired. Because the silence in the house was too loud. Because grief makes you hospitable in stupid ways. That first week was manageable. He fixed the broken kitchen cabinet. Replaced a flickering bulb in the hallway. Kept his voice down and his presence minimal. But by week 3, the dynamic had shifted. Subtly. First, he took the liberty of rearranging the pantry. Then he started labeling drawers. Then one day, I found my bedroom door closed with a sticky note on it. Knock first. Boundaries. I had to remind myself that I lived here, that it was my name on the deed, that this wasn't his house. It was mine. You shouldn't be staying up so late, he told me over dinner, a few nights later. Screens affect sleep. And those books you read? Not exactly uplifting material. They're murder mysteries, I said. Not crime scene footage. He smiled in that way adults do when they think they're winning a conversation with a teenager, except I was 26, and he was still treating me like I needed guidance on how to load a dishwasher. Things escalated quietly. That was his method. Nothing loud. Nothing obvious. Just rules delivered in the tone of suggestions. Disapproval masked as concern. Entire rooms I once freely entered now became his spaces. The study. The attic. The garage. He never explicitly banned me. He just occupied them so thoroughly, it felt like breaking and entering to reclaim my own territory. I told myself I was imagining things. That grief was coloring everything in suspicious hues. But deep down, I knew the truth. Uncle Martin wasn't helping me adjust. He was adjusting the house around himself. One Thursday morning, I found a list taped to the fridge. New house guidelines. The handwriting was neat. Bullet points. Numbered. 1. No guests after 9 p.m. 2. No use of the garage without prior notice. 3. Lights out by midnight. 4. Limit noise in common areas. 5. Meals to be coordinated to avoid kitchen overlap. I stood there in my flannel pajamas, barefoot on cold tile, reading rules written for someone who had invited a stranger into their space. I didn't confront him. Not then. I just stared at the list until the letters blurred into tiny prisons. My hand was shaking as I reached for the milk. It had my name written on it in Sharpie, not his. That night, I sat in my bedroom with the door locked, listening to his footsteps move from one end of the hallway to the other. He paused outside my room. I didn't breathe. Not even when the floor creaked and I heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in a lock, the study door. His new sanctuary. The one he'd quietly claimed as his domain. I didn't know what was in there, but I knew it was mine. Just like everything in this house. The walls, the floors, the haunted air between them. I'd inherited more than bricks and beams. I'd inherited secrets. And Uncle Martin wasn't just here for grief. He was here for something he thought I didn't know existed. But I did. Because 3 weeks before my mother died, she whispered something to me, too soft for the nurse to hear. She gripped my hand with strength I didn't think she still had and said, "Don't let Martin near the study. Ever." So I made a plan. I wouldn't confront him. Not yet. But I would find out what was behind that door. Even if it killed me. The morning he declared himself the master of the house, the sun hadn't even risen yet. I remember this clearly, not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was 5:42 a.m., and the sky outside the window still wore that deep, muted blue, the kind that lies about peace before the day claws its way into reality. I was in the kitchen, barefoot again, same cold tile beneath my soles, waiting for the kettle to scream. But the only thing that screamed that morning was Martin. He didn't knock. He didn't shuffle. He entered like thunder, heavy feet, aggressive breath, and a shadow that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. The kitchen light flickered once, then held steady, like it, too, was afraid to upset him. "I'm taking full control of the house," he said. No preamble. No questions. Just a cold verdict hanging in the air like fog off the lake. I turned slowly, not startled, but aware. Aware that this moment had been coming like a slow avalanche, and it had finally reached the valley. He wasn't wearing a shirt, only those plaid pajama pants that always hung a little too low, his chest pale and thinned with wiry hair, one hand resting against the edge of the dining table like he needed to anchor himself to deliver the blow. He stared at me with something unhinged in his eyes, something too wild to be sadness and too raw to be control. His mouth curled, but it wasn't a smile. It was the beginning of something else, something worse. "This house," he began again, louder now, more deliberate, "has always been mine. I helped pay the taxes. I handled the maintenance. Your mother was too sick to do anything near the end. I stepped in. I kept this place standing. I didn't say a word." The kettle clicked off before it could boil, and the silence it left behind felt like a courtroom going still before a verdict. "I gave this house a future," he added. "You think a paper deed makes you the rightful owner? That's ink. That's just bureaucracy. What I gave was blood and sweat. Real value." He stepped closer. His shadow touched my toes, and the air between us felt warmer suddenly, like the kitchen was suffocating slowly. "You," he said, his voice dropping now, quieter but colder than ever, "have 30 days. 30. Pack your things. Find a new place. I don't care where. Just not here." And then came the worst part. The part that confirmed what I already suspected was coming. "I am the master of this house now," he said. No irony, no sarcasm. Just absolute belief. That's not a threat. That's the natural order. I looked at him then, really looked. Not at the face I'd remembered from childhood Christmases or awkward birthday phone calls, but at the man who had taken root in a house meant to be my sanctuary. His eyes were bloodshot from whatever haunted his sleep. His hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline. He was preparing himself for the argument, for the tears, for the scene. I gave him none of that. Instead, I took one step back, lifted the empty kettle, and placed it quietly in the sink. The clink of metal on porcelain was the only sound that followed his proclamation. "I understand," I said, and my voice didn't shake. He blinked. Just once. A flicker of confusion passed over his face, like he couldn't process that I wasn't crumbling, that I wasn't begging. "I'll need some time to think," I continued, still calm, still composed. "So I'll be heading out for the day. Maybe longer. You'll have your space. For now." He didn't know what to do with that. I could see it in the way his jaw twitched, in the way his fingers tightened around the edge of the table. He wanted a fight. He needed the validation of conflict to solidify his authority. But I wasn't going to give him the privilege of watching me fall apart. I walked to my room. No hurry, no dramatic exit. Just the slow, steady sound of my feet brushing over the old wooden floorboards, each one a memory of childhood mornings, my mother's voice calling me for school, the smell of pancakes. All of it ghosted now. I packed a single duffel bag. Clothes, charger, the folder with the house deed, and a small, square photograph tucked between the pages of an old book. It was me and my mother on the front steps. She was laughing, hair tied back, holding a paintbrush, and I had my arms flung wide, covered in white primer from head to toe. We had painted the porch ourselves that summer. I was 16. The year she said, "I want you to always have this place, even when I'm gone." By the time I returned to the front hallway, Martin was nowhere in sight. The study door was shut. Locked, probably. I didn't care. Not in that moment. I stepped outside into the biting wind of early February, the kind that stung your cheeks and made your eyes water in seconds. I zipped my coat, pulled the bag onto my shoulder, and kept walking. I didn't look back. Not once. The house loomed behind me like a castle gone to rot, beautiful but poisoned. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't even check my phone. I just walked. Because I needed time to think. But more than that, I needed time to prepare. I didn't go to a friend's house. I didn't check into a hotel. I didn't even text anyone to explain why I was suddenly unreachable. Instead, I did what my mother would have done. I got organized. The county recorder's office sat like a forgotten relic on the edge of downtown, red brick, gray windows, and the smell of wet paper that clung to your skin. There was something oddly fitting about it. The building had the energy of a place that had witnessed too many family betrayals, too many forged documents, too many desperate people looking for answers hidden in municipal records. I stepped up to the clerk's desk, my boots squeaking against the polished linoleum, heart steady, voice clear. "I'm here to request a certified copy of a property deed," I said, handing over the parcel number I'd memorized a year ago, back when my mother and I met with her estate attorney in the weeks before her death. The woman behind the counter didn't ask why. She just nodded, fingers flying across her keyboard, the soft clack of the keys reminding me of rain tapping on a rooftop. "It'll be about 15 minutes, she said, already standing to retrieve the hard files. 15 minutes in a government office feels like waiting inside a padded purgatory, nothing soft enough to comfort you, but not hard enough to truly hurt. I sat in a cracked vinyl chair, palms resting on my thighs, eyes fixed on the dusty ceiling tiles. I wasn't nervous. Not anymore. What I felt was a kind of hunger. Not the kind that asks for food, but the kind that needs justice. When the clerk returned, she held a folder thick enough to carry the weight of my future. Inside was the title. My name. Only my name. No co-owner. No joint tenancy. No liens, no back taxes, no ghost signatures scribbled in fading ink. The deed had been filed 5 weeks before my mother passed. The trust had been created in her final lucid month. It had been notarized by a licensed professional, reviewed by an estate attorney, and processed through every bureaucratic hoop designed to make theft impossible. I took the certified copy, paid the small fee, and stepped out into the bright, unforgiving daylight. I didn't go back to the house that day. Not the next day either. Because I needed to be prepared for the moment I would. I spent the next 72 hours consulting the best damn real estate attorney in the Tri-County area. Her name was Frances Caldwell, late 40s, sharp-angled glasses, and the kind of voice that could make an arrogant contractor apologize before he knew why. We sat in her office, walls lined with real estate textbooks and degrees from NYU and Stanford, and I laid everything out. The trust documents, the death certificate, the certified deed, my mother's notarized letters, even photographs of every room in the house, some taken before Martin moved in, some after. The changes he'd made, the signs of control, the evidence of his escalating presence. Frances didn't blink. She didn't even pause. "He has no legal claim," she said, flipping through the documents with practiced grace. "Not as a relative. Not as a caretaker. Not as a tenant. And since there's no lease, he's a guest, one who has now overstayed his welcome. What are my options? I asked, voice low, steady. She leaned forward, hands clasped like a chess master about to corner a king. You serve him an eviction notice. Formal. Legal. Certified. He'll have 30 days to vacate. If he doesn't, we pursue formal removal through housing court. And if he refuses to accept it? I asked. She smiled without warmth. Then he can explain to a judge why he thinks emotional manipulation counts as property rights. Spoiler, he'll lose. I left her office with a manila envelope filled with strength. Legal strength. Unshakable authority. The kind of power that didn't come from confrontation or rage, but from precision. And then I waited. Until the morning of the 5th day. It was colder now. A thin sheet of frost covered the lawn like a breath held too long. I stood at the edge of the front walkway, the house looming in front of me, its windows blank as eyes turned inward. I knocked on the door twice. Not loud, not urgent, just enough to be heard without seeming desperate. It opened slower than I expected. Uncle Martin appeared, dressed in yesterday's shirt, jaw unshaven, eyes bleary. He looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just taller in ways he didn't understand. Back already? He asked, voice rough with half-swallowed disdain. I didn't step inside. Instead, I reached into my coat and pulled out the document, folded once, encased in a protective sleeve. I wanted to show you something, I said, handing it to him with the same calm one might offer a neighbor their misdelivered mail. He took it without ceremony, eyes darting across the page. The house was silent except for the sound of him reading. I watched the moment the words hit. The slight flinch at seeing my name listed as sole owner. The sharp intake of breath when he realized the deed had been certified last week. The crack in his confidence when he turned to the back and saw the notary seal, embossed, irrefutable. What is this? He asked, eyes narrowing. You know what it is, I said, arms folded. This isn't real, he snapped. This is a forgery. You can't do this. You can't take this house from me. I didn't take it, I said, stepping closer so he could feel the heat behind my words. It was never yours to begin with. He shook his head like the act might undo the reality pressing into his hands. Your mother, she wouldn't have done this without telling me. I helped her. I helped you. I didn't argue. Because it didn't matter. I've already spoken to a real estate attorney, I continued, my voice level. The eviction notice is being prepared. You'll be served formally by the end of the week. 30 days. No more. He looked at me then, not with anger. Not even with desperation. But with something close to terror. The terror of someone who has built a throne on stolen ground and suddenly realizes the earth beneath is crumbling. You're making a mistake, he said, but there was no force behind it. I'm correcting one, I replied. Then I turned and walked back to my car. The house stood behind me, tall, cold, silent. But no longer watching. No longer possessed. Because this time, I wasn't walking away. This time, I was reclaiming what was mine. For someone so loud when he was declaring himself master of the house, Martin was eerily quiet the day the eviction notice arrived. I didn't serve it myself. That would have been too easy, too intimate, too satisfying in a way I couldn't afford anymore. I'd given him the facts. I'd given him the paperwork. But when it came time to formally deliver the notice, I let the professionals handle it. A uniformed process server knocked on that same wooden door he had once locked me out of, and within seconds, the reality hit him like a cold wind in his bones. He didn't slam the door. He didn't throw the notice in the trash. Instead, he did what cowards do when backed into a legal corner. He looked for a loophole, some angle that would let him hold on to the illusion of control. For 3 days, he didn't answer my calls. Not that I made many. I had no interest in conversation. Every interaction had already been replaced by something far more powerful. Documentation. Then came the inevitable escalation, the moment the frightened ego lashes out in the courtroom of public theater. He hired a lawyer. Or at least, someone claiming to be one. Some general practice firm from 2 towns over, the kind that advertised on late-night television and offered free consultations over cheap coffee and promises. His argument was predictable, that he had established residency, that he had paid for house maintenance, and most audaciously, that he had an unspoken verbal agreement with my deceased mother. Frances, my real estate attorney, didn't even flinch. She'd seen it all before. She responded with every signed document, every trust certification, every time-stamped image and affidavit that proved the home had never, under any legal standard, belonged to him. The court date was set. But a week before the hearing, something shifted. Martin knocked on the door of my temporary rental unit, a place I'd chosen to stay during the legal proceedings to avoid any claims of harassment or intimidation. When I opened the door, he looked thinner. Not just physically, but emotionally. Like the gravity of reality had finally started pulling his delusions back down to earth. "I want to talk," he said, voice tight with forced calm. I nodded, let him speak, but I didn't invite him inside. "What are you really trying to do here?" he asked. "You want to see me out on the street?" "I want my house back," I said. "You had your chance to leave with dignity. You chose this." He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture more of a stall than a thought. "I could stay," he said finally. "But, as a tenant, if that's what it takes." I didn't blink. "You're offering to rent from me?" I asked. He hesitated, swallowing pride like it was acid. "Yes," he muttered. "Under a lease. If that's what the law wants." "It's not what the law wants," I replied, crossing my arms, my voice harder now. "It's what the law allows. The choice is simple, become a tenant or become a defendant. Either way, you no longer run that house." He agreed. Reluctantly. Quietly. But he agreed. 3 days later, Frances drafted the lease with clinical precision. Every clause was carved from stone, monthly rent due on the first, 3-day grace period, late fees, annual inspections, and 0 tolerance for unauthorized changes to the property. He was granted access only to the lower level and the second-floor guest bedroom. The study? Locked. Permanently. The master suite? Off limits. The attic? Sealed. I signed. He signed. Frances notarized. And on the 1st of the following month, like clockwork, a transfer appeared in the account for my newly registered LLC North Haven Property Holdings. Martin had just paid rent. To me. To the woman he'd tried to emotionally corner, gaslight, and ultimately eject from her own home. That morning, I walked into the old study, now converted into the central office for my property management company. I sat behind a sleek new desk, the kind with a drawer full of receipts and copies of all tenant correspondence. On the far wall, I'd hung a single framed quote from my mother, handwritten on an old note I'd found tucked inside her recipe journal. "Do not argue with people who are drowning in their own denial. Just give them a map and let them sink on their own terms." Under the LLC structure, all communication was now processed through a tenant portal. Rent requests, maintenance tickets, policy questions, everything flowed through the system. I didn't take phone calls. I didn't respond to texts. I wasn't his niece anymore. I was his landlord. And he hated it. I saw it in the way he refused to meet my eyes when we crossed paths outside. In the way he submitted 2 separate maintenance requests for a flickering hallway light, one with formal language, one with passive-aggressive sarcasm. I responded to both identically, issue acknowledged, technician scheduled. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just shows up as a system too clean to argue with. Within weeks, the shift was absolute. He no longer stomped around the house like it belonged to him. He didn't bark orders. He didn't rearrange furniture or leave passive-aggressive notes taped to the fridge. Instead, he tiptoed around like a guest overstaying his welcome, carefully managing his movements as if the walls themselves were watching. Because in a way, they were. The house had been fitted with motion-activated lights, a new digital lock system, Smart thermostats and energy monitors that alerted me if rooms were accessed after hours. It wasn't about spying. It was about structure. The same structure he had once tried to weaponize against me. He now lived by its terms. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted. It had been rebuilt, brick by brick, with documentation, litigation, and the quiet, merciless strength of someone who had stopped asking to be believed and started acting like they already were. I didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no victory speech, just the quiet satisfaction of equilibrium restored. Justice isn't loud, it's consistent, and it gets paid on the first of every month. It started slowly, almost like he believed I wouldn't notice. The first month, the rent arrived late by a single day, accompanied by a note submitted through the tenant portal, filled with rambling excuses about an issue with his bank's automated system. I didn't respond personally. I didn't call. I didn't text. I simply had the property management system issue an automatic late fee in accordance with the lease agreement. It wasn't personal. It was protocol. A protocol he had agreed to in writing. The next month, he was late by 3 days. No note this time. No explanation. Just silence where a payment should have been. He had once stood in the kitchen and declared himself the master of the house. Now he was dodging the responsibility of a lease he had begged to sign. The notice went out before the close of business. Not a warning. Not a reminder. A formal notice to cure or quit, a legal document stating that he had 5 business days to settle his rent in full or risk termination of tenancy and court eviction. No bluff. No drama. Just reality, printed on letterhead with a digital timestamp. He paid on day 4. But the message was clear. He was testing boundaries. He thought maybe I'd flinch. That I'd hesitate. That I'd let him slip back into the shadows of guilt and obligation, hoping that some part of me still saw him as family. But what he didn't understand, what he never would, was that family doesn't live rent-free inside your silence, while poisoning the air around you. He missed another payment the following month, this time by a full week. When the management company escalated the matter with a final notice before legal action, he had the audacity to leave a voice message on the customer support line claiming I was emotionally retaliating against him. Francis had warned me this would happen. Tenants like Martin, men who once wielded their control like a sword, didn't lose gracefully. They lost loudly. They lost clumsily. And when the rules no longer bent around their moods, they turned to chaos like addicts searching for a last fix. The system held. That month, he paid. Again. Reluctantly. Bitterly. But he paid. Because I wasn't arguing. I wasn't pleading. I wasn't telling him what was fair or unfair or trying to explain my side of things. I was executing a contract. And when you strip emotion from justice, it becomes unbreakable. By month 4, it was time. Time for what the lease called a routine property inspection. Every tenant gets one. Every quarter. Nothing special. Unless the tenant used to think the house belonged to him. Unless the tenant used to stand in the hallway like a warden and dictate what rooms you could enter. Unless the tenant used to call you a guest in the home you legally owned. When the email confirmation was sent, I could almost feel the static in the air shift, like the foundation of every lie he'd told himself had started to crack. North Haven Property Holdings requests access to 141 Linden Street for the purpose of quarterly inspection. The property owner will be in attendance. Please confirm availability within 48 hours to avoid rescheduling penalties. He waited until hour 47 to reply. Fine. Thursday. 11 a.m. I'll be home. The day arrived cold and clear, a sharp March morning that made the bones of the house creak with age. I dressed like a landlord, not out of vanity, but intention. Slacks. Black boots. A dark coat. Clipboard in hand. Frances accompanied me, not because I needed her, but because everything is easier when you have a witness who understands both the letter and spirit of the law. He opened the door slower than usual, wearing a threadbare sweater and bitterness like a second skin. He didn't greet us. He just stepped aside like a man opening the door to his own defeat. I didn't step inside with vengeance. I stepped inside with clarity. Each room was documented, condition noted, repairs logged, photos taken. The floors were fine. The plumbing was passable. The walls bore a few new nail holes. Nothing serious. Nothing worth escalation. Until we reached the guest room. His room. Francis opened the door first, but it was my hand that turned on the light. What we found stopped us both. Not because it was grotesque, but because it was calculated. A shrine. That's the only word for it. In the corner of the room stood a corkboard covered in photos, receipts, printouts of emails, old messages from my mother, clipped news articles, even faded images of the house from decades ago. There were handwritten notes in the margins, underlined passages, scribbled annotations next to property tax records and medical files. He had been building a narrative, a conspiracy, a version of events where he was the hero, the martyr, the rightful heir to a house he never truly owned. There were even letters, drafted but never sent, addressed to realtors, to probate courts, to historical societies claiming moral authority over the property due to years of caretaking during illness. Francis didn't speak. I stepped forward, fingers brushing against the edge of a photograph, me and my mother, painting the porch, our faces smeared with sun and sweat. There was a red circle drawn around my wrist, a note beneath it. She always resented me, manipulated her into signing over the deed. I didn't feel anger. I felt relief. Proof. Cold and quiet. The man who once locked doors behind me now lived behind one he couldn't hide anymore. I turned slowly, clipboard still in hand, eyes locked on his. He stood at the hallway's edge, arms folded, mouth tense. I never touched any of her things, he said. I never stole. I just wanted to preserve the memory of this place. I stepped past him, back into the hallway. Memory doesn't make you an owner, I said. And obsession doesn't make you a victim. Francis handed him a printed copy of the inspection summary and a request for voluntary removal of unauthorized documents related to personal family correspondence. He didn't argue. He just nodded once, stiff, robotic. We finished the walkthrough in silence. As we reached the front door, I paused just for a moment. I didn't say it for drama. I didn't say it for revenge. I said it because it was true. He kicked me out of the house. My hand touched the doorknob, the light from the hallway catching the glint of the legal pad in my coat pocket. Now I'm inspecting it, and he's reporting to me. And believe me, you won't believe what we found in his room during the inspection.